Thank you very much for that introduction, Fiona, and thank you very much for being with us as well, Mark. I guess we have a great example of two people living out their values here, and really that's essentially that message that Fiona is trying to convey there. And thank you also for that personal story, Fiona. It's very important to humanise these conversations at every opportunity. But essentially, as Fiona mentioned, this issue of values is the critical one that we face at the moment. And if you don't mind, I'll share with you my screen because I'd like to take you through the facts that underpin the threat, the nature of the threat that we're facing and where it comes from, what its nature is, and what we can do about it. So, in some ways, the journey I'm about to take you on is a little bit depressing. And it's a little bit like Alice Through the Looking Glass, or if you've seen the movie The Matrix, the issues of flipping the world as we know it to something that is the opposite of the truth is effectively what this is all about, and or poisoning of minds. And of course, in the Matrix, the funny thing there, of course, was is the one refuge for humans being rational and being free was Zion. But in any event, I'll take you through a deeper background of the sorts of information warfare issues that we're facing with this challenge. And you'll have to excuse me in relation to this text slide. It is busy, but the rest of them won't be like this. But it's basically, to summarize in a nutshell, the issue that we're facing against democracies globally. So the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, that's based in Stockholm, has recorded how 1 in 3 elections now are being disputed or distorted through various techniques and tactics. In nearly 20% of elections between 2020 and 2024, losing candidates or parties were contesting the decisions and casting doubt on the veracity of the decisions. And a lot of that has been driven by government intimidation, foreign interference, disinformation, and the misuse of AI in campaigns. The more frightening statistic has emerged from the VDEM Institute, which is at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And they've been examining for decades the dynamics around democracies. And the most frightening statistic in their latest report was that in the last 10 years, we've gone from 48% of the world's population living under autocracies to now it's 71%. And there are only 13% of the world's population, only 13% of us left living in liberal democracies. And there's a reason why that's happened. And it comes back to this issue of information warfare in many ways. There are a number of other factors, but this is a critical one. And the autocracies that are leading the charge with this threat at the present time are really practiced in this art form. And one of the key focal points of this, and one of the key generators of misinformation that other autocracies have now collaborated with, is Russia, or the former Soviet Union, or Tsarist Russia. It's quite a long tradition that they've had in this disinformation space. Under the Soviet Union, they refer to this as active measures, and they've continued that in the post-Soviet Union world. But the heritage of it goes back to the imperialist Russian government, where the Tsarist intelligence service generated the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's one of the most longest running and successful misinformation pieces in human history. And it's still getting plenty of traction today and circulating through social media. And I'll come back to that point. In Russia, of course, they went from the old Checker days to the KGB. And within the KGB, they developed one special Department D, which then evolved into what was called Service A. And the real leading figure in that process was a man called Ivan Agayants, who was conducting all sorts of misinformation experiments in Russia to refine the techniques. And it was under him that they started to take flight. And the specific goal and aim of those measures was to erode the United States of America from within. That was their primary goal, but they had some tangential ones as well, which we'll come to. So they would go from 50 specialists to 20,000 personnel by 1962 as the Service A department. And by that time, they were running around 400 operations per year. But between 1961 and 1964, they started to really volumize all those tactics and techniques through their galaxy of Soviet sort of satellite states like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Poland, and Hungary. But in particular, the Czech intelligence services, the STB, and the East German Stasi's HVA or Department X became the preeminent doyens of manufacturing false information. And it was particularly focused on this dynamic of the East German, West German focal point and contest. And one of the East German intelligence operators, Wagenbrecht, in that time said, what would active measures be without the journalist? And that underlines the point that throughout the history of misinformation, they have sought to use platforms to amplify and convince and achieve their outcomes. And in the time before social media, it was primarily journalists looking to get leaks and breaks to journalists who would be attracted by being able to get scoops, etc. But when we come to anti-Semitism, the long tradition that started with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was really picked up in full force by the KGB in that East German, West German conflict context. And this is a photo of the Cologne synagogue, which had recently been refurbished and restored under the West German government and had reopened in 1959. And immediately, these anti-Semitic graffiti scrawlings appeared on that synagogue. And here you can see Juden Raus and the swastika on the synagogue. So this was in Christmas of 1959. And this was a deliberate KGB campaign that they ran during that period. And the objective was to obviously sow discord and promote anti-Semitism in West Germany, but primarily to portray West Germany as still being Nazified, and so undermine support for West Germany. And they were, in general, during this period, of course, aiming to destabilise Western democracies and exploit social tensions. And this became a time-honoured tradition which they've refined over the decades. So even the Protocols of the Elders of Zion got a rerun during this KGB campaign. And so you had KGB operators who were actually getting out there and doing the scrawling on the synagogue and the graffiti, etc. But it succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. It not only sparked an unleashing of anti-Semitic graffiti and behaviour in Europe, but right around the world, in fact. And this, although starting in East Germany, you would have found examples then appearing in New York and London and all around the world. And in those times, there was actually a demonstration of 50,000 people in London against these anti-Semitic activities. These days, you're as likely to find a crowd of 50,000 people who are being exploited and used to promote anti-Semitic theories and tropes. But fortunately, the TV arrived, and the Eichmann trial in 1961 was very important in undermining that anti-Semitism campaign, and it petered out. But the KGB learned a great lesson out of that and the success story, and they practiced this operation on a Russian village before they tried it in West Germany and found the success they had there. But beyond that, then jumping forward a bit to the period of where technology becomes very significant here, because this is a critical point in what we face at the moment. So after the KGB, you had the establishment of the FSB, the GRU, and the SVR as the primary intelligence services of Russia. The SVR is their foreign intelligence service. The FSB is their domestic intelligence service like AGO, and the GRU is their military intelligence service. And then, of course, in the midst of all this was what was known as the Wagner Group, which became part of the private military corporation universe. And that's important because of how the technology was administered. So in St. Petersburg, there was established this special technology center to refine the technologies to exploit social media, the Internet Research Agency, which then worked on how that could be seeded into people's timelines, social media, etc., and bot factories to amplify that. They also expanded that opportunity through collaboration with East German organised crime groups and also Eastern European organised crime groups later on. In fact, in our 2019 election, I was advised that an experiment had been conducted using organised crime groups in Kosovo and Moldova. And this is the thing, through these agencies and their technologies, the Russians were often experimenting with elections around the world simply to practice their tradecraft, sometimes without caring what the outcome was going to be. And so the Cambridge Analytica story, which you might have heard of or read about, and the Brexit issue and how that was another focus for their operations through to the US election in 2016. And in 2016, they refined it to a really great art where they had the services of Cambridge Analytica, which is many ways a sort of a vehicle for Russian intelligence using their technologies and being financed by the Russian Alpha Bank, they were able to create this operation in San Antonio in the United States, which they called Project Alamo, because that's where the Alamo is in San Antonio. And they set up connections with the Trump election campaign and with all the various social media companies who had no idea what actually was going on in the background. And Facebook, for example, providing thousands of data points on each voter in the United States. And this was effectively exploited so that in the end, the operation was only necessary to focus on key battleground states and key what they call persuadables in those battleground states. And this was all surfaced in a 4-volume US Senate Intelligence Committee report in 2024. And the disturbing part about that, of course, is that busily for many years, the Russians were exploiting social fault lines. In the United States, of course, you have the glaring one of race in particular. So they would offset Black Lives Matter against white supremacists, for example. And they would look to find ways to stir up those groups against each other. Here in Australia, it's a bit harder to find fault lines, but this is where the whole anti-Semitism and Middle East situation then comes to the fore as an opportunity for them, not only around the world, but particularly in Australia, in an area where they'd found it hard to get a lot of traction. And so what happened after 2016 was the other alignment of autocracies watched what the Russians had achieved and said, this is a cheap way to obtain our goals. And so they combined their social media activities with their own legacy media outlets like Press TV and Hispan TV from Iran, Xinhua, and their other outlets from China, the Doppelganger RT, Telegram, bit platforms from Russia. And they were able to undermine Western media presence in the developing world because they were able to offer professional and sophisticated materials far cheaper than Western media outlets. And those outlets then became a complementary volumizer to their social media and internet activities. And China alone started investing between $7 and $10 billion in that international media effort. So their overall focus then became aligned as well from 2016. They agreed that effectively what they needed to do was send a message to the developing world in particular that we want a multipolar world. We don't want to see the hegemony of the old colonialist club, particularly the United States, that your opportunities to be great nations will emerge in a multipolar world. And they then portrayed the West as degenerate, that will take your children and give them to gay couples, or it's a whole range of themes around pedophilia, etc., in portraying the West, and that it was breaking down economically, and there was all this racial and social disintegration going on, which was partly actually happening thanks to their work. And so the effect of that, there's two main goals: to quell disillusion amongst their own populations about their societies and focus it on the West. So the basic message is you've got it as good as you're going to get in the world here, as opposed to what's going on in the West. So to try and damp down efforts to change the regimes in those autocracies. And then they were looking to corrode their potential opponents in the West and promote it. Even if you didn't believe everything you were seeing from them, you eventually developed a shell of cynicism and confusion about all media reports. And then in terms of moving into these fault lines that I mentioned, we come to this current Middle East situation. And the university campus protests are a really good example of how this played out. So initially you would have seen through TikTok, through social media, through all these things, they mobilized the youth to get out and demonstrate. And at first you could see there were some people in there with good intentions who were just simply wanting peace. And then that gradually evolved so that it became not peace, but war, in effect, arguing for the destruction of the state of Israel and the death of all its population. And then that moved to boycotting any companies that had anything to do with Israel and preventing the universities from engaging in research involving those companies. And then that finally arrived at the theme of boycotting any companies cooperating with universities on any kind of security research for even your own nation's benefit. And then you ask yourself, who benefits from that? The one advantage we have over China and Russia is a technological edge at present, and they've been assiduously working at trying to undermine that edge. So in this case, again, as we've seen historically, the Jews become a convenient vehicle for delivering people's power, and in some cases, as we're seeing now, with the stories emerging from this caravan incident, criminal elements seeking to exploit anti-Jewish sentiment or promote it for their own personal gain. A very recurring theme throughout the history of anti-Semitism. And again, they're exploiting technology by creating effectively this logger job technique of getting out there and through various criminal networking mechanisms offering money for committing anti-Semitic acts. Coming back to the threat that we're facing here. I call this the rectangle of rat bags, to give it a nice Australian colloquial description, which consists of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. And their interests are so closely aligned now, not only on these information objectives, but they've been forced more and more internally on each other because of the reaction to their imperialist ambitions and wars of aggression that they've initiated and the sanctions that have followed that. So they all collaborate to do an end run around these sanctions regimes, but also to support each other in their wars of aggression. And obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an obvious example. And now they're trying to portray themselves as the victims of the Ukraine. And we've seen President Trump parrot some of those thoughts by saying that the Ukrainians started the war. In Iran, you've got Iran running a galaxy of threats to the entire existence of Israel, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, elements in Iraq and Syria. And these organizations not only get involved in criminal drug running, etc., but also you have seen their objective is the annihilation of Israel. And in fact, ultimately, anybody who doesn't align with their extreme vision of Islam. And this comes back to Fiona's point about the nine-mile principle. They won't stop at Jews, of course, and that in every country in the region. The diversity that used to exist throughout the Arab world, the Middle East, North Africa, is disappearing or has disappeared in many of those countries. In Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were engaged in their activities in Egypt in 2013, and they are the grandparent of the Hamas organization. They're an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood. During that time, they destroyed or severely damaged over 60 Coptic churches and killed 45 people. So no one should feel safe. And in fact, when I talk about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, I come back to the Hamas covenant, which picks up word for word many elements of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was also made into a television series that came out of Egypt, which was very popular in the region, that dramatized the protocols, lies and furphies. But those issues surfaced again in the covenant, where they not only said that all Jews had to be killed and that the trees and rocks would cry out when a Jew was hiding behind them so that you could come and kill them. They also marked down Lions organizations and Rotary clubs as also being a part of the Zionist conspiracy, and that they should all be destroyed and killed. And then that bleeds into the other element, a sinister element of information warfare, which is perverting our youth's minds. And this is an example from a UNRWA textbook that Hamas distributes in Gaza, but you'll also find this material in the West Bank as well under the Palestinian Authority. This is an image, for example, that all apostates, all infidels will be burned. This is in a kid's school book. So this is another busy slide, and apologise for that. But the bottom line out of this is the European Parliament has issued about half a dozen reports over the last few years, really highlighting the vile nature of the educational material, in inverted commas, in the Palestinian territories. And in their last report last year, in April, they actually joined all the dots quite specifically, and they condemned the problematic and hateful contents encouraging violence, spreading anti-Semitism and inciting hatred in Palestinian school textbooks drafted by European Union funded civil servants, as well as in supplementary educational materials developed by UNRWA staff and taught in its schools. That's not me saying this. This is the European Parliament's official report on the subject. So they then said, yes, this kind of despicable terrorist attack that was carried out on the 7th of October comes back to the education to hatred that appears in these educational materials. And it doesn't only threaten Israel's security, but also it puts in peril the future for young Palestinians. And it's a generational problem when you see that mental poison going on through education. And if you were aware of the specific details of what occurred on the 7th of October, you ask yourself the question how the human mind is capable of enabling themselves to perform those incredible acts of horror. And I saw a lot of horror in Iraq, beheadings and so on, but this went well beyond beheadings. There were beheadings, of course, but some of the acts of gratuitous and sadistic sexual mutilation of their rape and murder victims just defies description. And it all comes back to enabling someone not to see the other as a human through this education material. So 5 times they've requested the European Commission, the body that allocates foreign aid for the Palestinian Authority function in education systems and their curriculum, has demanded that they modify this. And so far, nothing had happened. And this was another problem that we have with UNRWA, which caters for around 80% of the Gazan population, their schools. And the material is also, as I said, echoed in PA school books. What I find frightening is that similar dynamics are appearing in Australia and through this poisoning of that's the progressive side of our society's minds. And you would have heard perhaps the video recording of the New South Wales Teachers for Palestine group, where they discussed how they could indoctrinate their kids through their classrooms. And one of them was a maths teacher who said, yes, I'm going to use my maths classes to promote Hamas statistics on the casualties, which have always been utterly discredited. It takes us back directly to the information warfare of the Nazi period and on the campuses. And this is a group of Nazi students preventing Jews from entering a university campus. Those images were repeated in universities right around the world, including in Australia. And of course, there was the basic propaganda material where you portray Jews in a certain way, you portrayed African origin humans in a particular way as well, and often combining the two. This poster on the left-hand side is of a jazz musician, and you can see a Star of David on the lapel as well, combining the Jewish and black threat to civilization. Echoed completely in what we've seen recently in these demonstrations. This sticker was, I found, in Garema Place in the middle of Canberra, exactly replicating the style and the techniques of the Nazis. The fat caricature with the Star of David, if I don't steal it, someone else will. The irony is at the top of the sticker, it says, stickers are supplied for personal use, distribute responsibly and abide by the law. The irony of this is intense because the Holocaust began as an exercise in producing what were seemingly non-violent pieces of legislation, which over time became the death of 1,000 cuts. So the first piece of legislation ended in gas chambers. So this is deeply disturbing. And the worst part of this story is that I saw a man getting his young child to put these stickers up, and it was on the statues of Australian poets in Garema Place. Of course, those that were replicated in the Middle East many times, their ultimate goal was the destruction of Israel. So I don't get the narrative that's been distorted. Again, part of this misinformation piece, that it was the Jews that are the colonizers and that they've always started all the wars. They haven't started a single war and have only acted in self-defense. Historically, that is the fact. But these are the sort of materials that were distributed in Egypt and Syria, for example, in promotion of their wars. Their ultimate goal, the destruction and the murder of every Jew living in that land where they'd lived for 4,000 years. Coming back to the modern misinformation piece on this, this was a shot from a video that was aired by our ABC News. And it was meant to portray the deaths and casualties in Gaza. In reality, this was, and it's a video clip, but this was a video that was taken 10 years beforehand, and it portrays Egyptian students making a protest. And if you run the video forward, you will see one of these cadavers sitting up and talking to the person filming the video. And the ABC had to apologise a few days later for airing this. So this is the challenge we have right now with it's even infecting our legacy media. but also internationally, the autocratization of the UN, which is a reflection of the autocratization of the planet, effectively, is poisoning all their mechanisms, their agencies, their offices, and you have to ask yourself at the end of the day, who do their votes represent? So when the Chinese delegate gets up to vote, he's not voting for the 1.4 billion Chinese, he's voting for one man, Xi Jinping. When the Russian delegate steps up, he's not voting for 140 million Russians, he's voting for one man, Vladimir Putin. And so you will see that the mechanisms of the UN being used as a clearinghouse for their information warfare themes, to promote anti-Semitism, to promote anti-Israel assaults, to sanitize and legitimize their own regimes. And now you have Saudi Arabia sitting on the Women's Rights Committee at the moment. It doesn't get more ridiculous and ironic than that. And the same when you see Iran taking positions like this in their human rights mechanisms. So we're seeing them also trying to manipulate the developing world and deprioritize human rights campaigning that might affect them and their reputations. And of course, Russia and China both have veto power on the Security Council and use it ruthlessly. For example, when Russia was facilitating Syria's use of chemical weapons in a war that's cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives, every time the Security Council and the US tried to deal with the issue of chemical weapons in Syria, Russia vetoed the discussion. And now Russia is deploying those chemical weapons in Sudan, where there is an actual genocide occurring. So to finish off, talk about government responses that you've seen that have been happening out there. We've been looking to do improved cybersecurity for election systems as one part of it. But in terms of the education piece, we've seen some attempt at public awareness campaigns, nowhere near enough. We need to be getting into our schools in particular and really ensuring they are provided with the tools to think critically and to evaluate sources. And I know some of that is now starting to happen. In the US, the DARPA Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has got 3 projects running at the moment to attempt to tackle the technical means by which the deep fake AI generated material is being produced and source the pathways and the tactics of a lot of these misinformation campaigns so that at least we can fight back technically and be aware of them. A lot more obviously needs to be done. And it's about evenings like this and you going away and having conversations with your neighbours about these issues and then learning what the truth may be and then talking about that as well. So I'll finish there and I'll just point out there are a few good readings on this background, The Hacker and the State by Ben Buchanan, who surfaced what happened when Edward Snowden took a bunch of technology with him to Russia. Particularly good is Anne Applebaum's Autocracy Inc., which summarizes all of the strategy part of this nicely. And then the real full history of the active measures campaigns in Thomas Ridd's book. And then the Like War book, which talks about how social media is particularly being exploited here. So with that, I'll finish there.